Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another Tuesday, another episode of First Down South. It is March Madness in full swing at this point, and where we're coming to you from here in the state of Alabama, there's a whole lot of excitement, a whole lot of energy surrounding the tournament. We saw it a couple of years ago when a different school from across the state, from Auburn, went on a run to the Final Four. We're starting to see similar enthusiasm around here after Alabama trounced Maryland last night in the second round of the NCAA tournament. Joining me first off to recap that game, a son of Maryland himself, John Talty, to my right here, a graduate of the University of Maryland, and below joining me is the man with possibly the thickest Baltimore accent that I've ever encountered in real life, Matt Zenitz. So you guys both have a lot of familiarity with Maryland, with the seriousness with which Maryland fans take basketball. To start us off, John, just what was your takeaway watching what happened last night? I mean, obviously, I don't think anybody, even Alabama fans, expected that kind of explosion from that Alabama team.
Certainly it was, almost, I think, a historic shooting output in the NCAA tournament. So I don't think anybody can say they were expecting exactly that. But, Zenitz can confirm pregame, I told him, I think Alabama wins by at least 10 plus. And so some of what I saw I was expecting, because I think one of the key things, and Nate Oates ended up talking about it, about a text he got from Rick Pitino, but as we saw kind of, carnage across the NCAA tournament, that first opening weekend, the teams that really struggle in that first game but find a way to survive, you kind of expect them to come out more locked in that next game, because you kind of had that, what's going to happen here moment, which they had against Iona, which they shot very poorly from three. John Petty did not look locked in, just struggles across the way. When you find a way to survive those games in which you clearly did not have your A game, I think it actually gives you momentum and confidence. If we can play this poorly and still win, that means that's a good thing for us. And I think you saw them come out locked in, ready to go. There was that brief moment early in the game when Maryland was off to a nice little, hot start that maybe you're wondering, are they going to wobble again? And then they just absolutely barraged them with three-pointers. And so I think the version of Alabama we saw on Monday night is the best version of them, and a team that you could certainly see making it to the Final Four, if not beyond that.
Matt, what were your thoughts watching this game? Do you think Alabama's legit? Was this a big, sudden burst of scoring that would be hard to sustain, or you think this is a team that can keep running for another weekend or two?
I think the thing that sums that game up best is what Mark Turgeon, Maryland's coach, said afterwards, that he viewed Alabama going into the game as essentially the fifth number one seed in the tournament, and the performance from them last night confirmed his feelings about that. Confirmed it for me also. This is a legitimate threat to not only make a run to the Final Four, but to repeat what John said, potentially more than that also.
So Alabama has been part of the discussion, I think, around Alabama's run here so far is they've ended up with a pretty favorable draw in the tournament, partly because of upsets, partly because they're the top 2 seed. Just in terms of how those things were put together. But when you look at the remaining path right now, Alabama's going to face UCLA on Sunday in the Sweet 16. If they get past them, potentially a matchup with the number 1 seed in their region, Michigan. When you look at how those two teams have played so far and what you know about them, does the road still seem fairly favorable to you guys? How do you feel about those two matchups for Alabama, John?
Well, yeah, you talk about it. Their path to the Elite Eight is going to be incredibly easy. They're not going to play a single-seeded team just to get to the Elite Eight. That doesn't get much easier than that path-wise. UCLA is a Power 5 team, but remember, this is a team that was in the first 4. And so, I don't think the Pac-12 has impressed everybody, but I don't buy UCLA as some incredible team. Michigan's a lot more interesting if Michigan ends up winning. I think Florida State could give Michigan some problems. Florida State does not shoot the ball well. If anybody watched that game against Colorado, it was a disgusting display of basketball. But they're very athletic, and I think they could give Michigan some problems there. Where I think Michigan and Alabama would be very interesting is that Michigan has a true freshman in Hunter Dickinson, who is a big, strong guy in the middle. He can be dominant, plays Big Ten kind of style, and Alabama has no one to stop that guy. And so I think you'll see an interesting, dichotomy between the two different paces and strategies. You saw it some in the Michigan LSU game last night, and then LSU kept trying to speed him up, and then Michigan would try to slow it down. And so I think you're going to see a lot of that in Alabama and Michigan if those two teams end up matching up. It's just kind of this differing styles of play. And the big question for Michigan, too, is just whether they get, I think their best player, Isaiah Livers, whether he's back, for an Elite Eight game. He's, was one of their best players all season, has been hurt, hasn't, played the last 2 games. And so if he's back, I think that makes a big difference for them. Just the way that, I think Josh Primo made a big difference for Alabama.
For sure. Really seemed like he did. Yeah, there was, everything was hitting for Alabama last night, but Josh Primo really did seem to bring a big surge of energy to that team.
Pretty early on. Big Ten basketball breakdown. It's impressive.
This is like the one time this random collection of knowledge that I have has ever been useful. I've been watching a lot of Big Ten basketball, unfortunately, for years now, and it's never been useful in my professional life until this moment. So I got to get it all out, and it's use it or lose it. I'm never going to be able to.
That's right. The NCAA tournament is a great time for people who are like the certain breed of sports fan who packs his brain full of knowledge that he'll probably only ever have to use 1% of it, but you just like knowing that it's all in there. Matt, when you consider, the bigger picture here with Alabama basketball and this being the second year under Nate Oates, and regardless of where they go from here, even if they don't advance past the Sweet 16, it does really seem like the perception of the program has been kind of changed in a pretty big way. Am I right about that?
It's just amazing how quickly Nate Oates has helped to turn Alabama into a legitimate national championship contending team. And just looking specifically at this tournament, part of what's going to make Alabama such a difficult team to beat is there are so many different players on this team that create difficult matchups for opposing teams. So it's not like Alabama is one of these teams that's just largely dependent on one player. You have several different guys that are capable of beating teams, whether it's Herb Jones, who does so much not only defensively but offensively also. Javon Quinterly playing his best basketball right now. John Petty getting back into a rhythm. Last night, you have Alex Reese stepping up and playing his best basketball of the year right now, and then other guys like Josh Primo to go along with that. One of the interesting stats coming out of last night, so obviously Alabama hit a lot of threes. I think the final number was like 16, but you had 5 different players who had multiple threes last night. There are just a lot of talented guys on this team, and like I said, several different players that create difficult matchups for opposing teams, which is going to make Alabama a tough team to beat, whether it's for UCLA, Michigan, or even looking down the road, a team that looks very good right now in Gonzaga. All I know, if I were Mark Few, I would be very concerned about the prospect of facing Alabama at some point down the road.
Yeah, I agree, Matt. I do think that right now it's tough to judge based on one weekend, but
in Shackelford. I mean, the guy who led scoring last night, obviously a decent player also, and hit big time shots last night.
I think there's a few teams right now that look like, sometimes this can be a little bit of sports guys getting caught up in concepts that maybe aren't totally based in reality. But you do look at momentum. You look at teams getting hot at the right time. It does maybe feel like Alabama is getting hot at the right time in the season right now. That they, as ugly as that Iona game was, you go back and look at how they played in the SEC tournament and kind of down the stretch heading into that. It seems like they're starting to hit a gear that really we haven't even seen from them the rest of the regular season.
Yeah, Javon Quinterly is stepping up big time. So that was something interesting last night. So Mark Turgeon in his post-game press conference singled out Javon Quinterly and brought him up as somebody who was especially tough for Maryland to deal with last night, and especially difficult for Maryland to keep in front of them, and finished with a pretty impressive stat line in terms of 14 points, 11 assists last night for Alabama. So I have a talented guy for them leading the way, and once again playing his best basketball of the year right now.
And to use that as a little, transition to a tidbit here, this Alabama team that we saw last night reminds me of the school that Cornelia used to be at, Villanova. When they went on that run, I can specifically remember that Final Four game against Kansas, in which they, two of the top teams in the country, and Villanova just absolutely shot the lights out, and Kansas had no chance. And that's, I think, kind of what we saw last night. It's probably the closest shooting performance I've seen from that Villanova one a couple of years ago in the Final Four. And so, the way that teams are kind of constructed reminds you a little bit of Villanova, smaller, tough teams. They shoot a lot of threes. So if they can keep staying hot, it's very difficult to beat those teams in the NCAA tournament. Of course, the flip side, which we saw against Iona, is when the classic saying, you live by the three, you can die by the three. And so if you're bombing 33s and you're only hitting 6 of them, you're going to be in a tough spot.
Well, we will certainly be keeping up with what goes on for the remainder of the tournament. All of our March Madness coverage, by the way, here at AL.com, brought to you by Inline Lighting and Electrical. So thanks to them for continuing to sponsor all of our coverage of the NCAA tournament here in Alabama's incredible run thus far. We'll see how much further it will go. Let's pivot over to football. I know everybody's got basketball on the brain, but we're going to take a break from that for a week or so and see that next weekend. But for now, there's a couple of big football stories brewing. We'll get to spring practice in a minute here, but today all eyes are on Tuscaloosa as Alabama gets ready for what could potentially be their most star-studded pro day under Nick Saban so far. I mean, this is an absolutely incredibly deep draft class for Alabama coming out of this group. We knew a lot of these guys could have gone last year, decided to come back. It's a big part of why Alabama did what they did in 2020. But this is going to be a real, buffet for the eyes for NFL scouts who are in Tuscaloosa today. So many incredibly talented names, even without Najee Harris and Devontae Smith, who are both recuperating from injuries right now. I want to ask you guys, as we get ready for this pro day event today, look, we all kind of know who the surefire first round lock names are, but I want to go a little bit deeper into this class and ask you guys, is there somebody further down the list, maybe somebody who's not one of those first round locks that you look at, and if you're an NFL scout, you say, I got to put this guy on my list to look at for those second, third round, mid-round picks?
Yeah, one of the guys that immediately comes to mind for me is actually another one who's probably not going to be doing much of anything at the pro day today, but Landon Dickerson. So the biggest question with Landon Dickerson is obviously the injury history. He's dealt with several season-ending injuries throughout his college career, dating back to his time at Florida State. But just a hell of a player. He's one of the rare transfers who ends up coming in, and during the course of his 2 years with Alabama, becomes one of the most respected players in the locker room, a team captain type player, and obviously played at an All-American level this season. And one of the things that comes to mind with him is even early on, he had made enough of an impression at Alabama that not long after he got there and they saw him in practice setting and then what he was doing behind the scenes, a comparison that somebody on the staff made for him at that point was Richie Incognito without the baggage. So for people that aren't familiar with Richie Incognito's had some off-field issues, but on the field, 4-time Pro Bowler, had a long, successful NFL career, and it's a big-time compliment to be compared to that kind of player, while obviously emphasizing the part also, Richie Incognito without the baggage. So that would be a guy for me. If he can stay healthy at the next level, I would be surprised if he isn't a highly productive player that makes an NFL team very happy.
I love that comparison, by the way, of Richie Incognito without the baggage. I mean, isn't baggage most of what he is? I mean, it's he's smart, like all the bombing.
Yeah, but definitely that. We talk to our friend Cole Kublik all the time, and he's kind of my go-to when I want to know about an offensive lineman. Cole loves guys that have, he loves to talk about a mean streak, but he likes guys that have that big energy. And there's all types, but I think a lot of teams, there's a lot of appeal in having, particularly at the center position, somebody who has a very big personality who can kind of command the attention of the guys around him. And he definitely has that.
And he's a true leader also. So I think a lot of people in life, when you step into a new situation, you kind of feel things out and aren't necessarily outspoken right away. But something else that came up early on with him is that, I mean, he was holding people accountable early on in some of those early workouts when he first got to Alabama. And I remember hearing a story of him with somebody who was a veteran offensive lineman at that point and calling him out for being soft, even at that early point when he was at Alabama. So not only are you getting a great player, but you're getting somebody who is very much a leader and somebody who will be a great locker room presence to go along with that. I think really highly of him as a player and a prospect. Once again, the big key for him will just be answering questions during the course of this process related to the injury history and just having everything check out there as much as possible.
Don, any names jumping out to you out of those guys, out of those sort of mid-round pick guys that you think could be a good bet for an NFL team?
I mean, Dickerson would have been my pick. I think that's the one that makes the most sense because there's, I'm trying to go through these guys in my head and, there's going to be a lot of them going in the first round. So when you take out all the first round guys, I think Dickerson's the one that makes the most sense after that. Certainly if Najee doesn't go in the first round, and it looks like, most of the mock drafts have him in the first round now, but I could see him being early second. I think he would be another guy you might put on there. Someone like Alex Leatherwood, I think is interesting. I wouldn't, there's been issues there. And so I think where he goes and how they use him, whether that's as a guard, tackle, where on the line they use him, I think could determine his success. I wouldn't say he's a lock to be successful at the next level at all. But I think, certainly those are some of the guys that make sense. I think just big picture, pro day wise, for me, the thing that I'm most interested in of the guys who are participating is just whether anybody falls in love with Mac Jones. I think it was Adam Schefter the other day say that he thinks, there could be 4 quarterbacks taken in the first 6-7 picks. I think Mac Jones could be in that mix. All it takes is one, as we've talked about in the past. And I think, this year in particular with, no combine, they're not able to have guys on campus, for these private, on their property for these private workouts. I think these pro days are more important than ever for quarterbacks. I've seen it a lot in terms of the coverage of the teams that need QBs like the Jets and, how these pro day performances of Zach Wilson and Justin Fields and all that are going to be critically important. And you're going to see GMs almost make decisions in part based on what they see during these pro days. And so I think Mac Jones has a potential to, either really lock himself in as a top 10 pick, or maybe he, doesn't show what he needs to. And some of the concerns people have from an athleticism standpoint stand out. And maybe he's more in the back end of the first round.
Yeah, I do think. Go ahead, Matt.
On something that John said. So just to piggyback on what he said about Alex Leatherwood, if you're looking specifically for guys to keep an eye on during the course of the pro day today, that's a great one that John brought up. Alex Leatherwood's one of the more interesting guys that'll be working out today because there are questions with NFL teams about what position he fits best at the next level. Some teams view him as a tackle. Some teams view him as a better fit inside a guard. So he'll have an opportunity today to show what he can do. And he's not one of these guys that by any means is a first-round lock. So it will be an extremely important day for him. And then to throw one more out there to go along with that, Miller Forrestal. So a guy who obviously played a lot of football at Alabama, not a guarantee to be drafted at all, but had his pro day interview session yesterday leading up to the pro day. And the way he views himself is that he's one of the more versatile pro-ready tight ends in this year's draft, and obviously has a lot of experience from his time at Alabama. But it'll be interesting to see how he tests out athletically and how he does in front of all of these NFL teams, all of these NFL scouts today at the pro day.
Yeah, and another. This obviously is a little bit of a different topic, but can kind of transition us into what we're going to talk about next. A lot of times at these pro days, there are other guys, there are underclassmen that are there working out, and they're not there for the same reasons, but they get spotted. They get kind of some early buzz going, and I think a lot of these guys that we're talking about, these are guys that these NFL scouts have had their eyes on for a really long time because a lot of them have been playing since 2017. But I think the next group after these guys, they're going to be an interesting group because they've been a little bit in the background. They've been a little bit in the shadows. I think next year's group, is not going to have the same level of hype going into their senior season or their final season at UA as maybe this group does right now. So the season and how they actually play in 2021 could potentially have a much bigger impact for them. But like I said, some of that could start today in terms of getting attention from these scouts.
But before we get into that, I want to get your take on something, Matt. So you probably more so than anybody on our staff has been around Dylan Moses. So dealt with Dylan back to the early part of his high school career. I mean, it brought up Alex Leatherwood as one of the more interesting guys at the pro day today. I think Dylan falls in that category also. So someone who, I mean, think back a couple of years ago, looked like a potential or maybe even likely future first-round draft pick. And the stock and talk around him at this point just isn't anywhere near the same as what it was a couple of years ago. Just what are your thoughts on Dylan at this point? And I guess even just to throw out the same kind of question that we had initially in terms of guys that we'd be confident we would make an NFL team happy at the next level for picking them. What would be your level of confidence with Dylan based on what you've seen from him during the course of the last year since he came back from that injury?
Well, you know, his personal narrative aside, I think he did have a very impressive career at Alabama. Did he live up to the hype? That would be almost impossible because this was a guy who we've been talking about on some level since he was in 8th grade. So it's hard to match that. But Dylan was very productive as a college player. I don't know that he was necessarily the same level of productive as maybe some other guys who've been at those inside linebacker spots for Alabama over the years. And I think some of that was to do with, you know, having trouble staying healthy, but I don't think that was all of it. I think probably, to be fair to Dylan, another part of it is he's been at a position that traditionally has been much more focused on stopping the run, on, you know, fitting the gaps than what he's been asked to play in pass coverage, I think, way more than any other inside linebacker I can recall for Alabama. And some of that's just because of the evolution of the game and the way things have changed over the course of the time that Dylan has been in school. So, you know, look, I think some of it is perception based, and some of it is he's been there at a difficult transition point for the program. I think he's going to need to sell somebody on his ability to contribute at the next level in some maybe specific way at first. I don't think he's necessarily the guy that can be looked at as a, you know, as a all around great NFL linebacker. I think he could find a role for himself at first and then hope to grow into a bigger role. But I think there's unfortunately, as a lot of fans know and lament, there's some bad film on Dylan. There's a lot of good stuff too, but I think there are aspects of the game that he struggled with consistently.
I will say this, based on what we know about Dylan athletically, I'm pretty confident in saying that today should do nothing but help him. So Dylan, when he got to
he's an incredible athlete. Yes.
Yeah, when he first got to Alabama, was a guy who ran in the mid 4.4s, and just to be clear, that was timed by people on staff at Alabama. It wasn't like a laser time or anything like that. And I think when scouts were there, I want to say for junior pro day before he got hurt, had him more in the 4.6 range, but 4.6 for somebody his size is still a very respectable time. So you would think, just based on the athlete he is, that today should do nothing but help him. And he's definitely, to go along with the Alex Leatherwoods of the world, one of the more interesting Alabama draft prospects to keep an eye on during the course of the pro day today.
For sure. Yeah. So look, as you mentioned, that junior pro day can sometimes be really influential and can have an impact on how these guys are viewed going forward. Some of those guys are going to get a chance to do that out there today, and otherwise they're all already out there. They've already hit the field for spring practice, and in both schools here in the state of Alabama and Auburn, spring practice is now underway. We are preparing for a season where I think there are a lot of questions. And I know relative to what we've just experienced, people are probably going to laugh at hearing that. 2020 was the most uncertain football season really imaginable. I don't think we can ever have less certainty going into a football season than we had last year. That said, there were a lot of settled questions going into last season for Alabama. We had a pretty good idea of what Auburn was going to look like going into last season. We knew kind of the core offensive skill players there. There's a lot of questions on both sides. Auburn has lost a ton of their skill position talent. They do bring back Bo Nix, but he's going to need to find new weapons around him while he learns a new offense from Brian Harsin and that crew. On the Alabama side, you're talking about a pretty wholesale replacement of the kind of core of that incredibly productive offense. So I want to know what you guys. Let's start with Auburn on that side. John, what are kind of what's your biggest question or questions going into spring practice that you'd like to learn a little bit more about from this team this spring?
I think you already started hitting on it. And I think you could say it's almost the exact same question that we had headed into last spring practice. And that was last year, the big one for me was, how is Chad Morris going to help develop Bo Nix? How are those two going to get along? How is he going to help, push him to that next level? The answer, he didn't. I don't think we saw Bo develop the way that people thought he did. I don't think he had a terrible year by any stretch of the imagination, but certainly wasn't the guy that people hoped. So I think this year it's, how does Mike Bobo and how do Brian Harsin help Bo Nix develop to get to that next level? I think that's going to be something, given, like you said, all of the loss of offensive playmakers and Seth Williams and Anthony Schwartz and some of those other guys, there's not as much talent around Bo. I think Bo's going to have to do more next year. Certainly they have some good running backs coming back, and that will help as well. But I think that, Bo's going to have to take that next step if they're going to have the success that they need to. And so I think, we haven't seen him in months, obviously, and I think it's curious as how does Bo develop? Can he get good reps over spring? Can he show signs of being the guy that people thought when he first arrived there? I think that's going to be the question that hangs over this Auburn program until Bo leaves.
And honestly, it's a complicated question because it's not 100% on Bo. I mean, ultimately, Bo is going to be the one that gets the fingers pointed at him, but we saw last season. I mean, he's capable of doing some great things, but he can't do it alone. And I would say one of the biggest challenges that Harsin's going to have is, how do I make the whole offense work around this talent that I've got at the quarterback position? Matt, anything you've got big questions on outside of Bo Nix for Auburn this spring?
I mean, you touched on it some, but my biggest question, probably aside from that immediately comes to mind, is just who he's going to be throwing the football to. So they need to find some guys who are going to be making plays for him after losing Seth Williams, Anthony Schwartz, Eli Stove, the top three receivers from last year's team. So you have some young receivers that showed some flashes both on the field and also behind the scenes last year. They're going to be forced to step into bigger roles now. And the evolution of those guys is going to be one of the more interesting storylines, not only during the course of the spring, but throughout the course of the summer and fall camp also, leading up to the season.
Yeah, and I'll throw one in there too, just as we've touched on it here, but as a big point of emphasis. To me, I think the biggest problem that this Auburn team has had the last couple of years, really for most of Gus Malzahn's tenure, is the offensive line. I just think they haven't built the level of depth and talent at the top of that group that they need to have to be competitive at an elite level. And it's not going to be easy for Brian Harsin to just sort of coach his way out of that. I mean, he's going to have to eventually recruit really well at those spots. But in the meantime, it takes time to build up depth on the offensive line, and he's going to have to find a temporary solution. I don't think we're going to get an answer to that question in the spring. You kind of don't really know what you have there until they get out there in the fall and start going up against opponents. But to me, the offensive line is so important for the Auburn program and for Brian Harsin and the way that his career is going to go at Auburn. So that's one that they've got to find an answer to relatively quickly.
The great things for them, they'll have a very good defense to lean on, especially after some of the underclassmen who had a chance to move on, like Kobe McLean, Smoke Monday, Roger McCreary, guys like that ultimately decide to come back to school. It's left them in a position where they should be very good defensively. And obviously to go along with that, we talked about some of those question marks offensively, but they have a hell of a player leading the way for them at running back. And just overall with some of the guys that they have, factoring in the Sean Shivers of the world to go along with Tank Bigsby, they should have a very good running game to lean on. So I think Auburn may be more dangerous, more competitive, better this year than maybe some people may expect right now because of the capability for them to lean on those two components with that defense and that running game. So if you get a better play from Bo Nix, this could be a really dangerous team.
I will say I do really like the hire of Derek Mason as the defensive coordinator. I feel like I've thought that was a really good pickup for Auburn from the get-go here, and I think he's got a good group of talent to start out with. So I'm optimistic about that side of the ball for Auburn. Let's switch over to Alabama before we wrap up today and talk about, look, again, obviously this team is going to be rebuilding in a lot of senses. They had a lot of very young guys playing out there on defense last year. We know they're always stacked with talent on the offensive side these days because of how Nick Saban and his staff recruits. What are kind of the most interesting questions you'd like to get some answers to this spring, John?
I think, one of the big ones for me, and, I think there are a lot of things you can ask, but I think one of the big ones for me is just who emerges, as the leaders of this team. I think you'll start to see that in spring because I think this past year, and I know Coach Saban's talked about it, like you just had incredible leadership. Zenitz was talking earlier about Landon Dickerson. I mean, he was incredible. We're working on a project on Najee Harris. He's incredible. I mean, they had so many guys offensively and defensively that kept everybody accountable. And I think that's, makes such a huge difference, especially during a challenging year. So I think a lot of those guys are gone, whereas the previous year you had a lot of those guys. Should they go to draft? Should they not? A lot of them came back. That didn't happen as much this year. And so I just don't know. I mean, some ways you can judge it based on who Alabama makes available to us as media people. So, we had Brian Robinson and Christian Harris, the other day. So maybe those are some of the guys that are going to emerge. But I think overall, that's the question, just who takes kind of the reins? Who really takes over this team as I'm going to be the vocal leader on offense and defense? I just don't think there are that many known names at this point. I think spring is a good opportunity to kind of see who's going to be those guys.
And a difficult question to answer too when there's such a very likely a pretty young quarterback leading the team. So you got to find leadership somewhere on the team, and it doesn't always have to come from the quarterback position. Although, as Nick Saban says, it helps. It helps when your best players are also your best leaders. So we'll have to see how that part of it shakes out. I mean, technically, we are going into a quarterback battle this spring. It's not often framed that way, I guess, but we don't technically know who's going to come out of that. Matt, what's your big, unanswered question so far going into the spring?
As a quarterback would be an easy one, just because one way or another you're going to have a new starter there at quarterback. Obviously, we've talked a lot about Bryce Young. There's a lot of confidence about him and his ability, but one of the things that'll be interesting for me throughout the course of the spring is just the skill positions around him, the combination of running back and receiver. So at running back, you have a deep, a loaded group with a nice combination of a veteran guy in Brian Robinson who decided to come back for a second senior season to go along with some talented young guys who, I mean, with some of them, you saw some flashes last year with Jace McClellan and Roydell Williams, who people have been really impressed with behind the scenes, Trey Sanders, depending on his status coming back from that injury. And then you add a five-star freshman running back to go along with it. So for me, I'm curious to see how the workload ends up being divided. And just throughout the course of the spring, and Kamar Wheaton, the freshman, isn't there yet, but how some of these guys who are already in Tuscaloosa and coming back from last year's team, how they come along, and whether there is a running back or multiple running backs who start to emerge as lead guys throughout the course of the spring leading into the summer. And then with receiver, you obviously lose some pretty talented players in Devontae Smith and Jalen Waddle. You have a great player coming back in John Mechie, who was terrific in a complimentary role last year. Receiver, made some big-time plays. How does he emerge now as the lead guy and how do some of these players to go along with him in that receiver room start to, or how do they do now in bigger roles? And the interesting part with this also, with the receiver group, not only do you have some guys like Slade Bolden and Xavier Williams who have played, but you add some really talented freshman receivers to go along with that, who are very much going to be factors for playing time to go along with some of those aforementioned guys.
Yeah, I definitely do think the running back situation is very interesting to me. There's obviously a lot of talented guys there, but if I had to pick right now, I don't think there's an easy call as to who's going to be the guy who ends up with the rushing leader for this team in the fall. I think Brian Robinson did some great things last year, but
he would be at this point. He'll most likely get the first opportunity to be the lead guy. And obviously, like you said, did some good things during the course of the last couple of years and ended each of these last two seasons with more than 400 rushing yards. And if he had come out, would have had a chance to get drafted. But he's someone who I think will get that first opportunity and would be the safe bet right now to be the lead guy. But at the same time, you have some talented players in that running back room. They're younger, but definitely talented to go along with Brian Robinson.
I think Jace McClellan was very exciting to watch in his limited opportunities to play last year, and I do wonder if we could end up seeing something closer to like what we saw in 2018 or so, where it was really there was a clear lead guy, but there was a group that all was contributing a lot at that position. So.
And don't forget about Roydell Williams. So Roydell wasn't as big of a name as a recruit as Jace McClellan or Kamar Wheaton, but Roydell definitely made an impression throughout last year behind the scenes. And he'll be another one that's definitely worth keeping an eye on throughout the course of this offseason that could be a factor in that competition for playing time.
All right, guys. Well, we're heavy into spring now. There's so much going on right now that we haven't even gotten our chance to do our usual recap of Falcon and the Winter Soldier. We'll have to wait till after the NBA tournament is over before we talk about it. But I know our viewers
on Justice League, which Stacey and I also haven't watched as of yet.
Well, I haven't found the spare 4 hours to watch the new Justice League, but we'll see how that plays out. Guys, thanks as always for joining me and sharing your takes on all the stuff going on this week. As I mentioned, Inline Lighting, once again, our sponsor for all of our March Madness coverage. We thank you to Inline and hope to have plenty more of that to share this weekend as we continue to cover the NCAA tournament and spring football at Alabama and Auburn over at AL.com. Guys, thanks once again for joining me at First Down South.